Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, this past March, I actually had one of the coolest experiences of my life. I was able to present at a symposium at Yale University. The title of the symposium was The Potential and Future of French North American Studies, and I am incredibly excited to be joined this week by the scholar who gave the keynote address at that amazing symposium. Dr. Jonathan Gosnell is the Department Chair of French Studies at Smith College in beautiful Northampton, Massachusetts. Dr. Gosnell teaches languages at all levels and topics in contemporary French society and culture. His research examines articulations of French cultural identity outside of metropolitan France, as constructed in colonial and post-colonial worlds. He's the author of 2 book-length studies, Franco-America in the Making, The Creole Nation Within, and The Politics of Frenchness in Colonial Algeria, 1930 to 1954. Professor Gosnell's current work examines cultures of labor, leisure, and love within Francophone spaces in the New World, which is very, very cool. Dr. Gosnell, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And before we get to talking too much about your work, curious about your story. So can you kind of give us your background, kind of where you're from and how you became interested in the study of French language and culture?
Well, I'm originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but my mom decided to move to New England when my sister and I were kids. And so we literally picked up and moved to central Maine. And I found myself surrounded by Franco-Americans. I didn't know at the time that they were called Franco-Americans, but it was really kind of neat to me that I had this French-speaking community with French last names and interesting customs. My French teacher from high school, Mr. Snipes, he took us to local nursing homes where we sang French Christmas carols
Very cool.
every Christmas. And so I got to understand that there was this French connection in Maine that I knew nothing about. And honestly, what really captivated my interest and my family's was that we arrived in Maine and suddenly all of the jokes were about French Canadians, sort of
Sure.
the ethnic jokes that one
Sure.
talked about in the 70s and 80s. And the ethnic jokes, sort of the dumb ethnic sort of stereotype was labeled, that was given to people of Polish descent, in Pennsylvania. And so
Sure.
we were curious about this. We didn't understand. And so back in high school, when I was beginning, I'd already started studying French, and my grandmother was an inspiration for me. She took me on trips, but we would travel to Quebec City,
Cool.
for Maine. It wasn't far. And I was very excited. I was also terrified ordering my Big Mac in French.
That's
And
awesome.
so it was an exciting time. I was just kind of happy to be in an area where French was spoken because I had discovered this love of the language and culture, and I continued studying it. And all of a sudden I had a French-speaking place not too far away, and I would travel there with the Sear bus line that used to run out of Bangor. And they would take little old ladies up to Quebec City for a sort of a pilgrimage to visit. I think it's Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré, one of the
Yep.
big Catholic churches up there that people travel to from all around. And so, I just became fascinated with things French and sort of continued from there.
Yeah, and how did you decide, you know what, I can make a career out of this? Because that is what is very cool. There's a ton of people who have that interest, not a ton of people who find a way to make a career studying it, which is awesome.
I'd spent many years studying French and being very interested in French cultures, particularly outside of France. Why is it that there's so many places where French is spoken? It was hard, I don't have any academics in my family. And the fact that I actually was able to get a job after spending
Sure.
years studying these cultures and traditions, these really rich sort of traditions, it was pretty neat for my family to see, hey, this, I can actually find employment, after all of these years. And so I did, I don't always get to work on what's captivated me, research wise, but it's something that's really been a point of just a subject of curiosity over the years for me. And so it's been fun to be able to work on that, and to come back to Frenchness in New England has been super cool.
That is very, very cool. I do want to talk about, before we get to the subject matter of your presentation at Yale, which was a blast. I do want to talk about some of the courses you teach, because I was looking through some of the classes that you teach at Smith, and there's a couple that stuck out to me right away that I thought would be super, super interesting. And the first was, you said the topics in French cultural studies, France in America. And it seems like that, when you talk about in that course, is a lot of what we discuss with different guests on this podcast. So can you just explain what that class is about?
It's a course that looks at French and Francophone cultures, traditions, explorations dating from the 1500s, the 16th century, 17th century, when Jacques Cartier arrived, when Samuel de Champlain continued these exploratory missions for the French monarchy. We start with that history, and then we look at the continuation of the French diasporic family, continuation of French colonial interests, the development of French communities, the establishment of French colonial outposts in various parts of America. And then what's really neat, this is an eye opener for students. They don't know that here in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, there are people that still speak French.
For sure.
There are people like in New Hampshire, as in Maine, where I grew up in central Maine, and other parts of the state as well, of course. But for students to learn that there's a French connection, that French diasporic families are here, that we can go to the old French church, what was considered the French church in Northampton. We can visit the old Little Canada neighborhood. We can read we can actually see and flip through Northampton's weekly French newspaper, which was called The Citizen, Le Citoyen. And so this is kind of hands-on for students, and they get a chance to really see and to touch, in a sense. I take them on field trips.
Sure.
So I want them to experience, to see, to learn about the history, but also to see what's still alive, what's still living. How is it that people are still speaking French in New England after 4 centuries? They're just amazed to learn that the French were a marginalized, discriminated group again for a long period of time. That French was, that people were punished for speaking French.
Sure.
It kind of, they've heard about all sorts of immigrant debates, but for this to be connected to France somehow and French culture is really interesting for them. And so this is this course, France in America, is a upper level or what we call an advanced French culture course, and it's all taught in French.
Awesome.
And
very cool.
I occasionally get a student who is Franco-American. I've had at least a couple over the years. I did have a Kerouac, which was
nice.
Neat. Many years ago. And I had another student who was Franco-American. But for them to learn the terminology, to hear Franco, and to begin to say not just Franco-American, but to speak of les Franco,
sure.
It starts to begin to roll off the tongue. And this was a group that students knew nothing about. They've heard about Cajuns, and they've heard about some of them. They know about Quebec, of course, but the fact that there are people here whose ancestors immigrated and who went to French schools, who grew up in French, and in French and English, of course, and over the years, and but that's a revelation. And I like the fact that they're surprised, and they thought, some of these folks think they know everything.
Sure, of course.
Like all of us.
Well, you were in college, of course. You're in college, you know everything. Yeah. Absolutely.
Especially these are seniors. So
there you go.
But they're super interested, and they put together a website, and they've just completed a website on French cultural history, French cultural traditions, both living and historic, and so we try and create something that might talk a little bit about that maybe may inform some folks. So we've made it public, and it's something that I can share with people. We invited a couple of writers, one from Waterville, Maine. They visited with us. We Zoomed with them, and so we had a chance to talk with a couple of people who have contributed to knowledge and who are writing and write about the French or Franco-American experience. And so that course is fun for me to teach.
That's awesome. And I thought it was fun the way, I mean, just right from the very title of France in America is even amongst, I mean, the Franco-Americans that I know and talk to literally on a daily basis about these kind of things. We very rarely view ourselves in relation to France. We even have a conversation sometimes if like a team from France is playing in some type of sporting event. Are we close enough to be allowed to cheer for that team? Can we take any type of, cultural rooting interest? I mean, because both my parents spoke French, was their first language. They went to school half the day in French, half the day in English. But we never think of it as our allegiance or our ties to France. It's always to Quebec. And so to have that, the whole idea going back to France and the fact that France established these things, and this is the legacy that, France has left us, is probably not something that we think about too much.
And I think it's something that Franco-Americans like yourself, maybe, researchers, teachers like me, it's something that we can remind the French that there still is this connection. It's very distant now, but there's also that colonial connection past. And when, for instance, there's a long history of Alliance Française here in New England, and this is a very, very French institution. But the way they developed in New England, they were quite distinct, and they were led by Franco-Americans. Yeah. And so they were chapters of this very French organization, but that had a Quebecois, had a French Canadian or sort of legacy, and they were, in fact, they were founded by people from these communities, and so they were quite different in some ways. And that connection to France, to Quebec, would come up. For instance, in the 30s, when people were trying to decide and how to develop, there were how to continue this network of Alliance Française that had really sprung up.
One of the questions I saw in the description of this course was about what language one writes French America in today, which is, I think, another subject that is very complicated and very, very fascinating. So I'm curious that those conversations you have about that topic.
Probably one of the subjects we most delved into, the question, the problem, the conundrum of language. Some of the sort of the linguistic activists say you can't be Franco-American or you can't be Cajun if you do not speak the language. And so my students really wanted to reject that. They saw, they could witness that through cuisine, through music, you could continue to express a kind of cultural identity that had meaning. And so we didn't want to, or they didn't want to limit that identity. We know for instance, grandfathers and grandmothers and some of the elders who were involved in the survivance movement that, language was key. And we know how important it is to continuing to sort of connecting to the culture through language. But we know that language and cultural traditions and faith are all part of this. And Franco-Americans are continually developing new ways of expression. We really delved into this. How can you be How can you be Franco-American? Can you be Franco-American if you don't speak French? And it comes up in the films we watch. It comes up. We watch, for instance, Le Carrefour, or The Intersection.
Yeah.
We watched Waking Up French together. Put together by Ben Levine. And so the question of language comes up again and again and again. And I this is something that I've written about in some of the articles that I've published. It's clear to me that there are ways for Francos and for Franco-Americans to continue expressing cultural identity. And so I think we see that interest in language in some of the French tables that continue to develop in different parts of Franco-America. It's amazing to see what's happened on the grassroots level. People of French descent have founded and developed French tables in Waterville, in Lewiston, in Manchester, in Woonsocket, all over, in Lowell, Massachusetts, here in Western Massachusetts, in Northampton. There have been some. There are French groups that continue to get together, and people want, they talk about their language is a very emotional topic. People talk about being cut off from their language, wanting to come back to it. I'm amazed at people who tell me they insist they don't speak French, they don't understand anything, and boy, you get them talking, and French, there's a lot that they remember. They've learned in through song. They've learned their first languages. Like you mentioned, your parents, the language that they prayed and the language that they went to, their school language for many years was often French. And so I've seen time and time again French come back. And this is something that comes up in Ben Levine's film. Can
Right.
you reawaken? Can you reawaken French cultural identity and tradition? Can language that's sort of hardwired into our brains, can it be? And I think there's something there. I'm not a linguist by trade. That's not I'm sort of a cultural historian in terms of my education. So I'm coming at this from. I'm super interested in language, but I'm coming at it for maybe a more historical perspective, I guess. But
Sure.
I think there may be something to that sort of question that's psycholinguistic. People who delve into the brain and language and particularly children. And it's a fascinating topic. I think there must be something there. I have seen with my own eyes and heard with my own ears people who remember, whose French comes back, who can belt out songs and recite poems that they learned as kids. And so we know that there's so much that's still there. I think it can be expressed in French, English, and Anglais, as we say. And
Sure.
we've seen and that the writing, there's writing in English, but it's kind of like Kerouac's writing, which is kind of structurally English, or I'm sorry, French in some ways. It's written in English, but his first language through age, I think he only spoke French until he was 6 or 7. And so, there are lots of specialists who've asserted that some of the English language writing is really, really in some ways francophone and French inflected writing, and then we see all of the French phrases that come back. We read Rhea Cote Robin's book,
Mhm.
Wednesday's Child, and we had a conversation. We had a Zoom with her, and she's saying everything in French, even if it's in English. It's
Yeah,
all
that's
it's
cool.
all deeply French.
Yeah, it is interesting because I mean, even just referring to my folks, how I mean, it was both of their first languages, but it's been so long since they've spoken it. If you had to make them, if you had to pin them down, answer yes or no, do you speak French? I honestly don't know which one they would circle. Because if you ask them right now, the answer is a un peu. But I don't know if they would have the confidence to circle the yes, even though it was in fact their first language.
Yeah.
And I do think it's interesting too. Another debate I've heard really smart people who I respect on both sides of the topic of can you consider something as Franco-American literature if it's written in English? Or even if it's written by someone whose family hasn't spoken French in 3 generations, can it still be considered a piece of Franco-American literature? And it is just a topic that even amongst ourselves we talk about all the time. I do want to mention just one more course that you teach because I think this was kind of cool with the colloquium topics in French studies, the culture clash. Can you just describe what this is about? Because some of the questions when I looked at this course description are 100% things we talk about all the time in the Franco-American community.
This course is fourth or fifth semester French course when our students have come out of the language sort of sequence, and they're starting to read some novels, short stories, and maybe graphic novels, all sorts of different things. And so we read works that are written by people who are working class immigrants whose parents are peasants. There's a long and for a long time, agriculture was people weren't always working as farmers, and yet their connection to the land and to peasantry was huge, and people still identified strongly with the land. And so, although only 3% of the population was still sort of gainfully employed as farmers, and so we look at people who grew up in the countryside, whose peasants were farmers, and how do they identify? How do they begin to identify? How do they identify with Frenchness? What does it mean to be French? Do you have to be bourgeois,
Sure.
middle class, in order to connect with some of the French cultural values that are that are important. And so we look at how immigrants and French working class folks and more recent immigrants to France from North African communities, for instance, how they define Frenchness. Is it through the language? And here language is important. Is it the religion? Maybe not so much, although, you know, Islam is now the second religion in France. Can one be
Sure.
both is Muslim and French? Can one be, does one have to be Catholic in order to be Franco-American? So there are similar kinds of questions that in thinking about sort of what I work on in France and America, but also in this course called cultural class. We don't read anything Franco-American per se, but I'm sure some of my thinking is informed by the readings that I've done. What does it mean to be French? Can one be French outside of France? We know that Franco-American doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot to some people today, and sometimes you'd hear more, "Oh, I'm French."
Right.
In Waterville, Maine, where near where I grew up, in Lewiston, again, in all of these French-speaking places, in Holyoke, Massachusetts.
Sure.
You see this term, but is it, this is something that I think came up at the conference at Yale on Canadian Studies. How prevalent was this term Franco-American? We see lots of different terms, and we also see that people often refer to themselves as French. And this is
Sure.
something that I could do. I went to the French church. I went to the French school, and so I don't know if that does this word sort of have meaning to people today? A question that comes back in mind. Is it just something that people like yourself or people like me know about? I'm kind of curious. As people maybe get further and further detached from the French language, can one continue to be French, and how?
Yeah, and all of that is super fascinating, and I think very layered, and there's a lot to it. And on top of, I guess, who is French, a lot of it, and I saw this as part of the course description. Who decides? Like, who is this gatekeeper who gets to decide who is and then who is not allowed to call themselves French or Franco-American or whatever somebody chooses to call themselves? I think it's still a topic we have deal with all the time.
Yeah, and it's problematic in France because it's very class related,
For
and
sure.
sort of the upper classes kind of dictating through language, through culture, through sort of bourgeois, you know, life, what it means, who's got the power to define. It's interesting how that happens differently in different communities. If we're looking at American identities or French identities or Franco-American identities, who gets to decide what these words mean?
It just, for me, it was fun to see it as part of the lens of France, just because
Yeah,
I don't, from my day to day, I don't come across it in, the struggle, the issue from the France perspective. I come about it through just the conversations I have with the people I know here of
yeah,
who gets to call themselves French, who gets to be a Franco-American, and a lot of times, and again, determining who makes that decision, even among ourselves, I think sometimes we are the strictest gatekeepers of who is, like, the loudest voices I've heard anyway of the people saying you're not a Franco-American if you don't speak French are people who speak French and are Franco-American. It's almost like that my grandparents' generation would be, I don't know if they would consider me a Franco-American because French was not my first language. And they were
yeah,
the ones who, like you mentioned, the survivants, right?
yeah.
Part one of the survivants is you got to speak French, and if you don't have that, you're like not invited to the party anymore. And so,
Yeah.
and so the fact that this cultural gatekeeping is obviously going on in France, I'm sure I would have known that, but not something I give a ton of thought to on a day-to-day basis. So to have a course on that, I think is super, super fascinating.
I think here we're a department that we're kind of ahead of the curve in that we're looking at these different forms of Frenchness in different places, and so we're interested in places beyond France. There, because of France's history, you have all of these islands, all of these pockets where French cultures, French languages have developed, and the French spoken in France is very different from the French spoken, in Quebec and in northern Maine and in Louisiana. And so we have all of these really rich traditions, and why not study them and understand them? And I think there's a lot more interest and a lot more acceptance. The interest in there is, I think there's more acceptance in different varieties of French. We hear about international French, we hear about regional forms of Frenchness, we hear about France as a national language and international language. There are many different ways, many different registers, and so we, in another course that we teach, we look at how people speak differently in different situations. With
Oh,
it depends
sure.
on who we're talking to, and so our language changes and shifts. Professionally in our families, we speak differently, and so I like the fact that we're open. There is life, there is language beyond Paris.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting to learn more about those traditions.
What I would like to talk about now is this subject that was the topic of your presentation at the symposium at Yale, Snowshoer. And this was so cool to me because I grew up hearing both of my parents talk glowingly about how cool it was in Manchester when the Snowshoers would come to town, and you'd be like, you couldn't even believe the scene when they came. It was the greatest thing. You would think like an F1 race was in town, the way that they were talking about this. It was so cool. So can you tell us, first of all, what were these snowshoe events, and how did you find out about snowshoe events and get interested in this whole topic?
I have to confess, I'm not a snowshoer myself. I've done a little bit.
There you go.
But this was a real discovery for me in the archives. I had seen. I realized once I got into sort of the archival record, I realized that I'd heard a little bit about these super organized snowshoers. But a century ago, organized snowshoeing became a thing here in New England. Clubs developed with costumes and activities, and annually they would have national and international congresses or conventions where people would literally spend an entire weekend. I found this happens throughout the winter because different groups get together, but they get together and they actually do snowshoe, but they also parade around town. They talk in French. Language, culture, tradition, faith are kind of publicly expressed in ways that they sometimes are not so much. At the symposium, we talked about how quietly Francos tended to go about their business, and maybe we don't know so much about them in some. If you're not Franco-American, for instance, if you're not interested in this because of that quietness, but this was an occasion for people to be proudly French, to get together, to snowshoe, but also to express publicly that they had maintained, that they'd continued these French cultural traditions. Clubs began springing up, beginning in the early 20s. In 1924, the first organized snowshoe club was founded. It was organized by Louis-Philippe Gagné. He looked to his elders in Quebec who had already been organized as a snowshoeing sort of community club, a union. They'd been around for 30 years before that. Louis-Philippe Gagné came to Lewiston, Maine, as a very young man. He was only in his early 20s. He had been a sports editor for the Soleil in Quebec City. And almost as soon as he came to Lewiston, along with those families that came and settled and worked, in addition to those folks working in the mills, people came and they became the dentists, the
Sure.
teachers, and he immediately began working for Lewiston's daily, wasn't quite a daily newspaper yet, but it was the longest running French language Franco-American newspaper in Lewiston, which was called Le Messager. And for 40 years, Louis-Philippe Gagné wrote for them. He started off, he'd had some journalism experience, but he was an enthusiast, he was a snowshoer. And he thought, why not continue this tradition? He had seen clearly, he had experienced this in Montreal and in Quebec City before coming here. And there were clubs in Montreal and Quebec City. He took a model. Le Montagnard was a club developed in Montreal in the late 19th century. And he was able to model this new Lewiston main snowshoeing club that had its own motto, its own colors. Each club had its own unique colors. And so he founded this club, other clubs joined. People got together to snowshoe, to be together, to sing, to play music. Each club had its own bugle and drum corps that played along. So your parents probably heard they saw the Saturday night parade. They heard people marching through town.
For sure.
Where this was a French ethnic celebration that's not unlike St. Patrick's Day. People also celebrated during St. John the Baptist's Day.
Sure.
And so, but this was a kind of a chance for local communities to express their French identity, their Franco-American identity, and snowshoeing was a way of maintaining, I think, cultural traditions here. Anyone could take part in this. The whole family could take part. Louis-Philippe Gagné believed that this could help reconnect Franco-Americans with their French Canadian brethren who had sometimes forgotten about them. Sometimes we hear about how
For sure.
people in Quebec have forgotten that, their ancestors are here, just across the border, 300 miles away. And Louis Philippe, he was a really smart person, and he was astute. He was a hard worker. I've had an opportunity to speak with his daughter. She remembers this man who was born 125 years ago.
That's awesome.
And a century ago, he founded this one club that really set I believe a movement. It set, it sort of began a wave that continued. Manchester soon had its own. It began in Lewiston. There were 4 clubs: Le Montagnard, Le Jacques-Cartier, Le Cercle Canadien, Les Diables Rouges. Yep, those were some of the founder. But I must, for any Manchester listeners out there, Manchester was hot on the tail of those early Lewiston clubs. There were several clubs that developed: Le d'Avignon, Le Champlain, L'Alpin.
Sure.
And there were more women's clubs in Manchester. They developed just as the men's snowing shoe clubs were emerging. And there were in the late 20s, there were more women's snowshoe clubs in Manchester than Lewiston.
Oh, there you go.
So,
That's cool. And the
I
Alpine Club still exists here. We still have a building for the Alpine Club.
Yep, there's still some of those clubs. There are a few that continue today, and it's just amazing to me how these folks organized. It took an incredible amount of work, year in, year out. This took place all over New England, all over Canada, all over Quebec, in different places, in Montreal, in Quebec City, in Sherbrooke, in Ottawa or Ottawa. It's pretty phenomenal to me, and I discovered this world, that exists, but people have this. This is what I want to tap into, the people that remember. We need to interview folks. We need to talk about these things, because we know that as language, sometimes begins to disappear, we need to talk about some of the things that happened through language that continued also in English, but folks with memories of some of this stuff, because it was really important for some beginning. These were all done in French, and so we invited the mayor in, who gave an official talk. The governor spoke. Often there was it was always bilingual, even from the very beginning. But an effort to have these. Naturally, these events took place almost entirely in French. There was definitely some bilingual, production of the brochures that were produced in the local newspaper, the Manchester's English language paper, Manchester's French language newspaper, L'Avenir National. There were, for days and days, there was coverage about these events. Every year, this was an annual event. I'm sure, based on what you've said about your parents, it was anticipated. People looked forward. Yeah, look forward to this event. And again, the planning, it was an enormous amount of work. And so thankfully, the record is pretty substantial. as historians, as cultural historians, as a someone who's interested in cultural traditions, the record isn't complete, but we have we can make out quite a lot of because of what we have, in Lewiston at the Franco-American collection at the University of Southern Maine, at St. Anselm's College, in their collection. There's a lot. There's a lot to look through because people organized and they've left a record, and it's almost entirely in French. I think that people in English, people in Manchester who were not Franco had to pay attention to this because
Oh,
they
of
knew that
course.
everyone who was French or Franco-American was paying attention, and so there are ads, in French and in English in the papers, and so people are definitely trying to tap in because they know that local communities are really connected.
And it's cool because the way my folks were kids, when these groups would come through Manchester, the way they viewed these athletes, like they were the snowshoers from Canada. Like so they would have those races and they would watch the races and they would view these, participants in these races like the same way I would have viewed like a Boston Celtic, when I was a kid, It was like these snowshoers, they were like celebrities to the kids in the area. It was just so cool.
Yeah, they were world records. They were world
Right.
record holders, and these athletes. It's interesting that you describe them as athletes, and that's the way the kids at the time recognized them because you know weeks before anyone arrived, the press would talk about the arrival. They arrived by train. There were trains from Maine, trains from Montreal, the trains from Quebec City, the trains from Lewiston that arrived in Manchester. There were songs that were written by Louis-Philippe Gagné, founder, often credited as the founder of the snowshoeing movement. He wrote, he was a poet, he was a songwriter, he was a journalist, he was a snowshoer, but he wrote the sort of the songs that were sung in French by these joyous French snowshoers who were met at the train station. And so they marched, the times, their arrival times were listed in the
Yeah.
newspapers. They were met at the train stations. They marched with their liaison from Manchester who would take them to their hotels and their clubs. And so they would sing and march through the streets, starting on Friday night when the trains would arrive, continuing on into Saturday morning. Again, all of the events were anticipated. The races that took place on Saturday, often followed by the traditional bean supper on Saturday.
Yep.
On Saturday evening for
That's awesome.
the queen and the princess of the carnival, it was called, of the competition, of the congress. They were dressed and were stars of the event along with the athletes, and so it was a real to do, and it was a huge of cultural event that concluded with the Sunday mass. After that, there's I believe that the racing was important. The Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon racing. Often the prizes were given out both on Saturday, according to press accounts from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, through the early 2000s. Prizes were sometimes given out on Saturday evening. Sometimes they were given out on Sunday. On Saturday, there was the torchlit parade took place in which all of the clubs marched. There was a huge celebration in 1953 when the Lafayette Club of Manchester celebrated its 25-year reunion. And so folks got together for that torchlit parade on Saturday night, for instance. After the races, after that torchlit parade, when all of the clubs gathered in formation, and this was again listed in the newspaper how these different clubs would parade through town, in which order, and what were their colors, what were their sayings, like toujours joyeux, always joyful. These were some of the mottos of some of these clubs. Tous pour un, all for one for all, was the motto of Le Jacques
Awesome.
Cartier. Yeah, so it was just a neat. These were the stars. It was neat how these folks got together, what they did. It captivated attention, and that continued through the parade. That continued on Sunday to one of the French churches, one of the Catholic churches in town, where a French mass was held. And so sometimes that was the last event. Sometimes prizes were given out after Sunday mass. So they would reward the athletes with the prizes that they'd won for their competitions. The male snowshoers, the female snowshoers all raced. And so sometimes that athletic competition closed out the activities. To me, this was something that people could count on. You know, you knew they were coming. You anticipated their arrival. You spent time with them at all of the clubs, all of the local, all those Manchester clubs, all of the Lewiston clubs, the Montreal clubs, the Quebec City clubs. Activities took place around the weekend, around the entire, 3-day event. And so I'm sure folks were exhausted.
Oh, yeah.
By the time they headed back to their homes, and those crossings, those border crossings happened annually, regularly. They were expected, and they were a great source of joy. And I think maybe it help people make connections. Sometimes those connections have been lost between French Canadians and Franco-Americans, but this was a way that they were restored, and Louis-Philippe Gagné thought that it was important.
That's so fun. It's funny you mentioned you're from Philly, because when I'm hearing these stories of, you get each individual like neighborhood group, you get your own costume, you get your own sayings, music. Everybody plays their own music. You have a big parade. You have a party amongst your group. It's like that's a mummer, except it's up here and it's French, and that to me is so cool.
Yeah, and we see these kinds of events where people bring together their music, their language, their culture, their traditions, their religion. What's interesting is that religious piece. I think sometimes.
Oh yeah, that's a little different. You don't see that in the mummers parades I've been to.
No. But you may have similar kinds of people trying to get it together. They've been partying for a couple of days. They've got to they've got to remember their songs, and they've got to remember their and so. But the musical connection is important, and people this parade, this kind of public display of French cultural identity, it doesn't happen without the music, without the costume, without the color, without that French joie de vivre, which was part of it. It's all part and parcel of being French, I think, in America. And how do we keep that going? I feel connected to this, although I'm not, by family lineage, I'm not connected, but my wife is French Canadian. My own grandmother taught me French, and after moving to New England, she encouraged me to speak French, and my grandmother got a chance to speak with Franco-Americans in Central Maine, who welcomed her, who understood that she couldn't express herself entirely in French, but she thought it was important to try. And this is something that was really made clear at this Franco-American grassroots French table that's developed in Waterville, Maine over the years, and people still get together in a cafe in a different place now. Any you can come with whatever French you have.
Sure.
However French you're comfortable speaking, if you're going back and forth, it's in some of the French groups that I've sort of gotten to know here in Western Massachusetts, everything accepted. There are people who listen in French and speak in English. There are people who speak in French, and so everything is accepted, and if you're open to that, if you're not going to criticize anyone, if you recognize that people come to these places wanting to have their French and their French culture be accepted, because they may have grown up having that be questioned and disparaged. My grandmother said bonjour,
Yeah.
And I love the fact that she joined me for one of these meetings with Franco-Americans, and before she passed, and that was kind of meaningful for me, because she was my French connection in a lot of ways. So I'm glad that Franco has accepted her.
This is awesome. Well, this has been an absolute blast. This conversation has completely flown by. We've been speaking with Dr. Jonathan Gosnell, the Department Chair of French Studies at Smith College. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. This has been very, very fun.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.